Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Amen. Got off my knees and put it into my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
What you know, good Ann Camp? You're listening to the Ann Campaign's Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney, a.k.a. Bishop Cooper's grandson. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can probably tell I look pretty tired. I just flew in from L.A. this morning, about 12:30 this morning, and now I'm recording this podcast early, but I had to get this to you because this is an important episode. This is the final Church Politics Podcast episode before the 2024 presidential election, the final one. And what a ride this has been. We've talked to you and given you episodes after 2 assassination attempts, after a crazy primary process, all the things that have happened. The Church Politics Podcast has been here to try to talk through it with you, to give you some commentary and some analysis from a biblical point of view. And this is the final one, man. This is the final episode prior to this election, which will be on Tuesday. So let me say this. Make sure that you go vote. Be thoughtful, be prayerful, vote, and leave it there. All right? We'll get into that a little more later. The first thing I want to do, though, and I know we usually use this time, this introduction time, to have some fun, to talk about sports, to talk about music and things like that. But since this is such an important episode, I want to jump right into some serious stuff, okay? The first thing I want to do is I want to correct something that I got wrong last week. And y'all, especially the folks on YouTube, called me out for it, and I appreciate you called me out for it. When we get something wrong, we want to very quickly correct it. And I got this wrong. It was an honest mistake, but I think it's significant, and some people might have taken offense to it. So I want to make sure that I correct it and that I speak on it and make sure that's the first thing that I do on this podcast. Last week, I talked about a visit from Vice President Kamala Harris to a church here in Atlanta. And for some reason, and I hesitated when I said it because it didn't sound right coming out, but I had so many other things to think about. I just kind of kept it moving and didn't figure it out until it was too late. But I kept saying New Life Church. That's where this visit happened. It was not New Life Church. It was New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. New Birth, not New Life. That is my mistake. Let me be very clear. It wasn't any shade towards anybody. I kind of hesitated when I said it because I know both these churches. I don't know why, at that moment I just had a lapse. But I do want to make sure that I cleared that up. And I'm glad that y'all said something about it. And I'm also going to fire Slewfoot Sammy for not catching it before it went out. You know what I'm saying? So I apologize. I'm going to try to keep from doing that again. But when you are on, when you're on podcasts all the time and you're constantly talking, sometimes you just make those mistakes because you got so many things that you're thinking about and trying to make sure that you communicate it right, that sometimes you just get things wrong. But my mistake, I was wrong. It was New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, not New Life. All right. My bad. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this past year, this election cycle that is about to end. Because the AND campaign, specifically me and Chris Butler, came into this election cycle really wanting to make sure that we prevented certain things. Okay. And so we took days and hours and weeks and months to come up with some disciplines to help Christians get through this moment. We took a lot of time, a lot of prayer, a lot of Bible reading, a lot of reflection to create these disciplines. And I want to kind of give you a summary because our proposition coming into this election cycle wasn't all that complex, but I think it was powerful. And what we were really trying to say is, number one, regardless of what happens and regardless of how consequential this election is significant, but this election isn't ultimate. You need to treat your political opponents with respect and civility, no matter how serious your disagreements are. No one, this is one of our major propositions here, no one is simply who they voted for. No one should be looked at as a political abstraction. Your opposition is an image bearer made in the image of God, and they should be treated that way. You don't know everything about somebody based on how they're voted, and you surely, as a Christian, cannot treat people with contempt based on how they voted. You can disagree with them. You might need to feel you need to correct them, but when you do, you need to approach them with respect. Another one of the propositions that we put out there was have some humility. Understand that your side does not get everything right and hasn't gotten everything right. And during an election cycle, that's so important to remember, because all this propaganda and all this messaging that you're getting is going to try to turn this particular election into very simply a battle of good versus evil. But if you read your Bible, if you believe your Bible, then you know that you are not good. And while your side may very well be doing more good than the other side, you are not good and they are not purely evil. And so you need to look to see what your side gets wrong, and you need to take the time and maybe step out of your bubble to discover what they might actually get right. Because as a Christian, even if the other side gets 99 things wrong, the one thing that they get right, we have to acknowledge it and be honest about it. And that is so hard to do during election season. But we've asked people to do that. We also talked about your media intake. What type of information were you taking in? Was it good information, or was it just confirmation bias? Because whatever your intake of media was going to impact your output. It was going to impact your opinion and what you thought about the issues. And so we asked people to kind of disconnect themselves from cable news and get some better sources so that they can have a better opinion about this election and about others, to make sure that you were arguing against the best arguments on the other side, not just the characters and misrepresentations that we often get from our favorite cultural influencers and commentators. We wanted Christians to take the time to actually know what the other side is saying. I can't tell you how many times I go into a certain space and they talk about the other side, and it's the worst possible representation of the other side of the argument. That doesn't mean that every argument on the other side is good, but you better do your due diligence before you criticize the other side. You better make sure that you're arguing against the best arguments. Because again, cable news and some of our influencers will have us thinking that everybody on the other side is out of their mind, is malicious, and just spends all their time trying to make sure that they do wrong to us. Well, I'm here to tell you there are malicious people on the other side, but everybody on the other side is not intellectually dishonest nor malicious. And if you think that, the problem may be more internal than external. We also talked about how, again, this was a significant election, but that it wasn't, again, ultimate. And there were a lot of things that we could do on a local level that would be more direct and have a greater impact on our community. That we were going to vote and that we were going to take this seriously, but we were also going to look to what we could do locally, who we could team up with locally, maybe even people that voted differently than us, to have an impact on society. We talked about how this one vote is important, but this one vote is not the whole of your public witness. So you don't have to stress out over it. Be thoughtful, be prayerful, vote, let it go, and do something else locally. And we're going to help you guys do that in this next coming year. But those were our propositions. That's what we came in here, and in some, that's what we came in here talking about. Civic pluralism, understanding that people have a right to have different beliefs than you and that you need to protect their right to do that even as you disagree with them. Civility, kindness, all those things do not go out the window just because this is a very polarized election. And if Christians can't get that, how do we expect everybody else to get that? So that's what we came in saying. And I want to kind of talk about some of the blessings for the AND campaign that happened in this very dynamic election cycle. One of the major blessings that we had was just the ability to travel all over the country with this messaging. I'm talking about from LA to DC to Pittsburgh, and shout out to all those folks in Pittsburgh. If you are in Pittsburgh right now, there is some very committed Christians and devoted Christians who are trying to start a chapter out there. If you're interested in joining that chapter, you can email us at engage@andcampaign, andcampaign.org if you want to get involved with those folks who are starting a chapter out in Pittsburgh, okay? But we were all over the country. I'm talking about we went to Florida, and we were at a conference for Christian NFL players and presented the disciplines. We've been to schools all over the country, Harvard Law School, a whole bunch of Christian schools all over the country. We've been to conferences all over the country. It's been excellent. I just was able to go on Lecrae's podcast. Then I went on Megan Ashley's podcast. Then I went on the Perrys. I'm about to be on Esau McCauley's podcast. That's a blessing. Because there was a day when none of those folks knew me. None of those folks knew anything about the AND campaign. And it's a blessing to be able to be on those platforms, right? It's been incredible, and it's all God. There's nothing about our message that guarantees any of that would happen without it being part of God's plan. And it's been a blessing for us. Another thing that's been a major blessing during this election cycle is how the AND campaign has been able to go into very diverse Orthodox churches and be trusted to talk about faith and politics. Any good shepherd of a church knows that you don't just let anybody come into your church and talk about faith and politics, because those can be very divisive issues that can break up the entire church. And so to know that throughout the years, we've built up the trust among different demographics to do just that is huge. We go, just like I talked about earlier, to a church like New Life, which is primarily African-American in a very democratic area, and are able to bring our 10 disciplines. Then we go to a place like Perimeter Church, which is in a more, I would say, Republican area, and more of a white evangelical church, and we bring the same disciplines and get the same response. And that's encouraging to me, because it shows that we're not as disconnected as sometimes we think we are. And to build the trust on two different demographics that don't come together often enough is huge. How many other organizations can talk about faith and politics in those very different spaces and show those spaces that they're not all that different after all? That is a blessing, and that is something that was beyond anything that I could do, anything that the AND campaign could do. I'm truly thankful for that opportunity, and we're going to build on those relationships, build on the trust and opportunities that we've had in those spaces. Because we are in a unique place as the AND campaign. So that I'm thankful for that. But I'd be lying to you if I didn't say that there were also some very serious disappointments. There were some transitions. There were some hard moments for the AND campaign where we had to say, either we're going to speak the way we say we're going to speak, or we're going to stop doing that and maybe get a few more resources. And I hope you know that we chose the right thing. We chose to say, you know what, we might not get this grant or that grant, but we're going to say what we have to say. And guess what? The Lord provides. All right. One of the big disappointments that we had this year was we were planning a faith and politics forum where we were going to bring high-ranking Democrats and Republicans together to have a conversation a few weeks before the election. We wanted to have a conversation about how we can work together and how we commit to moving forward together regardless of what happens. And it was looking good. We were getting some responses from folks in high places. But then the commitments started kind of pulling away, and it became very clear that elected officials and others just didn't have an interest in doing something that was talking about bipartisanship during an election. People were primarily concerned with getting their candidate elected. They didn't want to spend the time to have those conversations. So I said we canceled it. We're not canceling. We're rescheduling it till after the election, because I think it's still going to be important to have those conversations. But it was a disappointment that we had to reschedule that. And when you've been playing something for over a year, putting your hard work into it, reaching out to people, bringing in partners, that's not an easy thing to let go of or to push back. But we did that, and I think it's going to work out well. But again, it wasn't easy. Something else for me that there's even personally that's been disappointing is, and I've learned a lot during this election, but it's become clear to me that during the election season, there were some allies and some friends and partners who kind of moved away from the AND campaign framework, who, from what I can tell, because there hasn't been a lot of conversations around it, let me say this, it's very hard to maintain the AND campaign framework during an election season. It's very hard when you want one person to win, and I understand that, to speak in a way that might not be good for that particular candidate at times. So the AND campaign, we're not just going to spend our election season saying things that help the narrative of one side. We're not going to stop challenging both sides just because it's an election season. That's not who we are. We're not here to make sure anybody gets elected. We're here to tell it like it is, and we're here to give people props when they deserve props, and we're here to critique them when they need to be critiqued, regardless of if it's election season or not. And it became clear to me that everybody is not able to do that. So we have some allies and friends and partners who haven't really been interacting with us as much during the season, right? Haven't been interacting with our content as much, haven't been sharing it and things of that nature. And that's okay. And I want them to know I still love you, and I'm going to be here in the same place after it's all over, and we can start where we left off. But I can't say that it hasn't been disappointing that in the moment when it's most important for us to be impartial, in the moment when it's most important for us to say, I'm putting this gospel-centered framework over partisanship, to see that there were people close to us that just couldn't do it. And that doesn't mean that, people can't support a certain candidate, but it was very clear that folks were a little bit upset. Like, how could you critique my candidate when the other candidate's so bad? How could you do that? And they kind of moved away. And I fully expect them to come back and have those conversations, right? But it was clear that that didn't always happen, and that people felt like, well, let me give this a break real quick, because this moment is too serious to be talking about all that impartiality and bipartisanship and all that. And that's part of some of the things that we saw during this period. So it hasn't all been easy. But I want to let anybody who felt like, man, I don't really want to, say anything that hurts the narrative of one side, and therefore I'm not really rocking with Ann in the same way during this time. I'm going to let you know again that I love you, and I'm going to be here when you get back. All right? Because that's just who we are. So that's kind of an overview of what's been going on with the AND campaign. It's just been a dynamic moment, a very dynamic moment. And we are glad to be able to share that moment with many of you. And I want to say this, for all the people who, when I go to different places all over the country, who say, man, I love the Church Politics Podcast, I've been introducing people to it, you don't know how encouraging that is to me. Because the enemy can mess with your head. The enemy can tell you ain't nobody listening to you. You might as well give up. You're wasting your time. And I'm not immune from that. So to hear you guys say that to us when you're not sure who's hearing you and what impact you're having means the world. All right. So y'all keep listening. I'm going to keep talking. And I greatly appreciate all that you're bringing to the AND campaign, because we're in this together. All right. Now, as always, I want to give a shout out to all our supporters for supporting us in what we do and how we do it. Okay. If you are interested in getting more content like this, you need to become a premium subscriber. Yeah, we're going to continue giving you this content, but there's even more content that can come along with this. So if you go to patreon.com/churchpolitics, you will get an additional episode every week, where I'll talk about things that I'm not necessarily going to talk about on this particular part of the podcast. So for instance, today, after I get done with this part of it, I'm going to the premium episode, and I'm actually going to give some predictions. I'm going to give an update on where I think the campaign is, and I'm going to give a prediction on who I think is going to win. All right. And so for all you guys that are patrons, you will get that information. All right. So anyway, y'all know what it is. Grab your Bible, get your mind right, and prepare to think not like a Republican, not like a Democrat, but to think like a Christian. All right, y'all, let's go to the scripture. And this morning, I want to go to Matthew 5, verses 21 through 22. And it reads, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." You know, I have conversations with my sons all the time about name calling. And to some extent, they don't seem to understand why name calling can be such a dangerous and hurtful thing. And so it's one of those things that I have to reiterate to them over and over again, because I don't want them to be the kind of people that just are going around calling people names and throwing out labels and not thinking about the impact that it has. Because based on what I read in the Bible, what we say to people and the names that we call people can have eternal consequences. That's how I read it. Unfortunately, this seems not to be a lesson that many in our public square, and more specifically, many in this 2024 election cycle, have learned. Because the name calling in this last week and a half or whatever has just been ridiculous. And so it doesn't start here. I mean, well, let's say what it starts. You know, one of the people who, there was always some level of name calling in politics. It didn't just start. But I would say that former President Donald Trump brought that to a new level and was willing to call people names and carelessly throw out labels unlike anybody before him. Okay. Now, when we go to this particular election, this starts up again with a comedian named Tony Hinchcliffe, who is at a rally in Madison Square Garden for the Trump campaign. And during he's a comedian. This is a guy who's a comedian. And if you look at his work, he makes fun of everybody. But we have to understand that the context that he's in. He's at a presidential campaign rally in Madison Square Garden, and he basically makes a joke calling Puerto Rico garbage, and things just blow up. I think a lot of people on the left, rightfully, and some may have taken it too far, pointed out that that's not something that should be said at a rally. Why in the world? And let me back up here. Why in the world do you have this type of edgy comedian speaking at a political rally just weeks before the election? That was a major unforced error by the Trump campaign. that shows a level, and I'll talk about this a little bit on the premium episode, but there may be a level of overconfidence to even do something like that. But this was not something that was helpful to the campaign. I think the campaign really hurt itself by putting somebody up there who would say such a thing about a whole country, right? That should not have happened, but it did. And the Trump campaign did disavow it and kind of tried to move on, although I've heard a lot of conservatives try to downplay what was said and say everybody was being overly sensitive. And some people were, but in general, that shouldn't have been said. That was not the time and place for a comedian to make those kind of jokes. And that was a mistake that could have an impact on this election. So we have the garbage comment. Then, and I think this may have happened a little bit before, you have the Harris campaign come back and basically compare what went on, and some people in the media as well, compare this Madison Square Garden rally to a Nazi rally. Apparently, back in the day, I think in the 1930s, some Nazis actually hosted a rally at Madison Square Garden, and you see the campaign and people in the media comparing these two things, basically calling the people who went to this rally Nazis. Guys, words have to matter. Labels have to matter. And why I think there's a lot to disagree with when it comes to MAGA America, and probably a lot of disagreements on what was said at that rally. Nazis? Really? See, I think that this crossed the line in a way that is just ridiculous. Do we really know? Are we really considering who the Nazis were? Are we really considering what the Nazis did? The Nazis put people in concentration camps based on their identity. They placed women and children in death camps. They placed women and children in gas chambers and killed them and stacked the bodies up as high as they could go. They tortured people and falsely imprisoned people and so many other things. The atrocities that came along with the Nazis should not be taken lightly and should not be used simply for political purposes. And I'll say this: the Harris campaign has gone way too far, because it's not just surrogates saying it, it's not just the media saying it, it's the top two people making these references. That's going too far. And just like many of the things that are being said, some people are calling Kamala communist and all these other things. It's lazy. Make your case without reaching for the most hyperbolic and overstated way to do it. There are many other ways to describe a campaign that you disagree with, a person, even if that person is dangerous, that you disagree with, than calling them a Nazi. It's lazy. Take the time to articulate an argument that connects with people without using the most outrageous thing that you can say. And we sit there and we go along with it. The crazy thing about it is when the garbage comment comes out, everybody's rolling on the ground on the left. Everybody's freaking out. And I thought that it was a terrible thing to say too. But then maybe a few days later, Joe Biden basically, and some people would say it was a mistake. I don't know about that. I'll let you be the judge. Joe Biden basically says that the only garbage, in response to the garbage comment, that the only garbage that he sees is Trump supporters. And instead of having the same outrage, instead of reacting impartially and holding up the same standard to both sides, a lot of people on the left made excuses and started talking about grammar and where we put different apostrophes and all this type of stuff, rather than saying, no, they're both wrong. And that's part of the silliness that becomes of a political campaign. But I think we have seen this particular election go to places that I haven't seen many other places go. I don't recall any other campaign calling somebody a Nazi. There are so many ways to say somebody's dangerous. What they're going to do is dangerous. But to call them Nazis based on what the Nazis did is terrible. And then to come back and try to act like, oh, we're all together. We want to bring the country together. You can't have it both ways. And that is too far. And I would have liked to see people on the right and people on the left look at their side, look at the campaign that they're supporting and say, that is too far. Stop it. There's got to be a better way to communicate. There's got to be a better way to get your message through to people about how serious this election is and why they should vote for you. But to use communist and Nazi and to call people garbage and to get upset when one side says it, but not to get upset when the other side says it, this is in major part what's wrong with our politics. This is why we see each other as hypocrites, but because we don't hold the same standards. And when we get desperate and when we want to win, we will say and do anything, even if it's not accurate, even if it's not helpful. But what I want to tell Christians is you better watch what comes out of your mouth. You better watch which labels and characterizations that you support, because for us, based on what the Bible says, this has serious consequences. I even saw somebody on Twitter talking about, well, you guys are worried about what somebody says. I'm not going to compare what somebody says to, the deaths of unborn children or to some other policy that's going in. This is about policy while you're worrying about what somebody says. What somebody says has an impact on a lot of other things. If I call a group garbage, that could be the start of something that leads to them really being treated like garbage. And when we start to dehumanize other people, when we start to belittle up other people, that opens the door to greater atrocities. What you say matters. And the Bible continually tells us that what we say matters. What comes out of our mouth is consequential. And that God, not Justin, but God will judge us based on what we say about others and how we talk and characterize others. These are big deals. And for both of these campaigns to resort to this kind of labeling and name calling is just incredibly disappointing. To think that's what they think what is necessary to win is so lazy and so below the office that both sides are trying to get to. You can decide which one was worse and all that other stuff. I know you guys are always concerned about not making comparisons that make people think that the two are the same. I'm not saying they're the same. You make that decision. In this instance, they were both wrong. Not anybody on either side am I seeing being a Nazi. Now, are there people on the extremes outside of the campaigns that say all kind of crazy stuff? For sure. Do I disagree with a lot of things that are being said in MAGA America? Absolutely. But Nazis? I think if we really take that label seriously, we wouldn't use it so loosely. Garbage? After all that's gone on in this country, after all these conversations about immigration and people from other places, we haven't learned not to talk about people a little better. Look, Christians, we can't control what these campaigns will say about each other. We can control what we say and how we hold people accountable. This was unacceptable. I'll be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Amen. Got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
All All right, we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. All right. I ran into a really interesting article in the New York Times, and I wanted to share this with you along with some analysis of what actually happened. I think this is really a microcosm of what's been going on in different sectors of, well, let me not say that. I really think this is a telling, because I don't want to say a microcosm. That may be too strong. I think this is a telling example of why people are losing trust in certain institutions. Okay. So here's what's happened. This is coming out of the New York Times. An influential doctor and advocate of adolescent gender treatment said that she had not published a long-awaited study of puberty-blocking drugs because of the charged American political environment. The doctor, Joanna Olson Kennedy, began the study in 2015 as part of a broader multi-million-dollar federal project on transgender youth. She and colleagues recruited 95 children from across the country and gave them puberty blockers, which stave off the permanent physical changes like breasts or a deepening voice that could exacerbate their gender distress known as dysphoria. The researchers followed the children for 2 years to see if the treatment improved their mental health. An older Dutch study had found that puberty blockers improved well-being, results that inspired clinics around the world to regularly prescribe the medications as part of what is now called gender-affirming care. But the American trial did not find a similar trend. Dr. Olson Kennedy said in a wide-ranging interview, puberty blockers did not lead to mental health improvements. In the 9 years since the study was funded, the National Institute of Health and as medical care for this small group of adolescents became a searing issue in American politics, Dr. Olson's team has not published the data. Asked why, she said the findings might fuel the kind of political attacks that have led to bans of the youth gender treatments in more than 20 states, one of which will soon be considered by the Supreme Court. She said she did not want her work to be weaponized. Again, this is why there's a lot of distrust of institutions in America. This is not how science should be handled. A scientist should not go into a study with preconceived notions that they're trying to protect while doing that study and then not release the study when the results don't come out the way they should. One of the major problems, and we saw this blow up during COVID, is that a lot of people believe that the experts, the scientists, the people who have expertise in other areas, that the experts are ideologically captured, that the experts are too political themselves. When it comes to studies, when it comes to science, the scientists doing the studies should not be making political calculations. Whatever the result of the study is, that's the result of the study, and you have to let the people and the public discourse and all that stuff land where it may. It's not your job. You can't be the politician and be the scientist. That's the opposite of being objective. It doesn't matter what you think the outcome will be. You need to release the data and release the study that was paid for by Americans, right, with your tax dollars. The scientist just needs to release whatever the findings were. The scientist is not supposed to say, well, what would the impact on society be? Or what would the impact on this issue be? Or would the outcome be one that I don't like? And that's how I'm going to decide whether or not I'm going to release this very important study. So we can talk about that before we even get into how important this study is on a very serious matter. We're talking about puberty blockers given to children. We're talking about giving children something that will change their lives forever. And now we're finding out that that we're not even getting all the information on whether this is good for them or not. It says that many of the children still were suicidal and that they still were very distressed even after this happened. What I really want you guys to see is how important it is that we separate our science and our true expertise from politics and from ideology. Science is supposed to make observations and tell us what those observations were. Science is not supposed to say, well, I already have a preconceived notion, or I already have a conclusion that I want to come to. And if the information doesn't end up, the data doesn't end up supporting my conclusion, then I'm going to withhold something that was paid for with millions of dollars of taxpayer funds. Especially when it comes to something involving such an important issue. Part of the problem, and let me say what I always say when I approach this issue, I truly believe that there are people that are genuinely struggling with this issue. I don't believe it's all about groomers and all that other stuff. I think there are people that are genuinely struggling with this, and I pray for those people, and I pray for the parents and children that are in this struggle, because I can't imagine that it could be easy. And God loves them, and God is with them, and we should all be praying for them. All right? With a serious issue like this, my problem with the so-called experts is that you have people in certain areas who came to conclusions about gender identity, who had their philosophies and their ideologies on this, and it did not go through the public discourse. You had people who did studies or took studies and just kind of imposed that on the public. And now we're seeing that some of those stuff they did so without all the information, without even releasing all the data. And so how things should happen is, as we see people in academia and different spaces come up with ideas, try to find solutions to issues like this. And I'm glad that there are people who are trying to find solutions to issues like this. Once they come up with those ideas need to go through the public discourse. Those ideas need to be tested and critiqued and go through a process to make sure that they're a good idea. But what has been happening on certain issues, especially when it comes to stuff like this, is you have people in academia and scientific spaces that are coming up with ideas or have concepts that don't go through the proper process, but then they automatically go into policy. And they're going into policy and affecting what's happening to children before they're even being really tested and going through the public discourse. That is not how things are supposed to work in democracy. And when people talk about their issues with the experts and their issues with the elites, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a system where people on a certain side of the ideological spectrum come up with stuff and then just impose it on others before really making sure that it's what America agrees on, that it's what has come to a certain consensus. That's not how this is supposed to work. That's more of an oligarchy. That's a government run by the experts, or a government run by people in certain agencies, not a government run by the people. And more, I think the source of this problem is you have people in these elite spaces, you have people in these expert spaces that just do not trust the people with the information, that think their job is to tell us always what exactly we need to do and not have what they're doing be checked, and have the checks and balances that have to be a part of the process before it gets to policy. That is wrong. And she says she didn't want it to be weaponized politically. I hear you, but guess what? That's not your role. And if people are playing multiple roles, if people are playing scientist and politician, then our society doesn't function how it needs to function. That is not within your discretion to make that decision based on a political calculus. You withheld a study that the people paid for with millions of dollars that could stop some of the things that are going on with this issue, that could save children from actually going through something that's not helping them, but that at the same time is changing the whole trajectory of their life. And you held it because you didn't want it to be weaponized, or did you hold it because you didn't want it to go against your preconceived conclusion? Guys, that's not how this is supposed to work. That's not how democracy is supposed to work. If you are in a space where you are an expert, that's great. Give the people the information. Let it go through the discourse. You cannot skip over the people and go from an idea, a hypothesis, to policy and just throw away whatever study, whatever facts, whatever data doesn't go along with your conclusion. That is incredibly dishonest. And it's going to have a negative in those things as they keep happening. If we keep allowing these things to happen, if people in those places don't have the integrity, or they think they know so much that they can keep the true information and the facts from the people, it's going to do a lot of damage to this democracy. I'll be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up, but with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Amen. Got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And I am back on the Church Politics Podcast. I want to end on this note. I want to end on really focusing on how we should respond to whatever the outcome will be next week with this election. Because how we respond, and I've been saying this over and over again, how we respond to this is going to tell people something about our faith. It's going to tell them a lot about our faith. If we react like the world is over because our candidate lost and everything's coming to an end, that's going to tell people about what we really believe about our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and how his hand is on all of this. And that whatever he wants to happen at the end of the day, when it comes to our lives, when it comes to this country, when it comes to this world, will be. If we truly believe that, we can only get so upset, so out of sorts about this particular election. And I don't want to downplay the election. This is a consequential election, but how we respond has to say something about our faith and how we view our worldview, how we view the world, and who's really in control of what's going to happen at the end of the day. All right, we have to think about that deeply, especially in this moment. As I said earlier, the response that the AND campaign received to our 10 disciplines, to our civic revival, has been amazing. I've heard people say it's given them hope. It's been encouraging. It's given them perspective. It's made the process of deciding who to vote for and how to vote less stressful. And really, that's the impact that we wanted to have. And it's been a blessing to have that impact. But I'll be honest with you, I was part of one particular meeting in the last couple weeks that really made me worry about the mental health, and this is all jokes aside, that really made me worry about the mental health of a lot of people once this election is over, if their candidate doesn't win. In this particular meeting, I probably heard every single cable news, conspiracy, and propaganda point that there was. There was talk about slavery. There was talk about the Civil War and assuming the worst. And so let me say this right now. especially to leaders. Anything you say from here on out about this campaign better be laced with hope. Because if you get people, this is what you have to understand. If you get people so riled up that they're just fearful and desperate and they're running to the polls out of pure fear and desperation, if they lose, what are they going to do then? And not everybody has the foundation and the support around them to make it through mentally with all this fear that's been built up around them and around this election. So while for you, it may be a means of getting somebody to vote the way you want them to vote, for them, it could be a dark place that they're going into that they can't get out of. That they really believe that if their candidate loses, it's all over. That everything's gonna go sour and everything's gonna be terrible. Yes, this is consequential. Yes, how you vote matters. No, I wouldn't go far as to say that. And I think it's irresponsible to say that. I couldn't believe how I've been around some people that just didn't want anything hopeful to be said. That tried to make anything that was said that was hopeful seem naive or like it's not taking this situation seriously enough. Christians who hear something hopeful or hear something encouraging and say, no, it's so bad that we only have to talk about the negative stuff. It's so bad that all the talk about charity, that all the talk about civility, that all the talk about treating your opponents with respect, there's no place for that right now. Let me tell you something. As Christians, there's always a place for that. And as Christian leaders, if we're not giving people hope, if we're making people hopeless over an election cycle, yes, some bad things can happen, some bad policies can be put in place, but you're taking people's hope from them. Here's what gets me. Do not allow yourself to go into a place or do not communicate with others in a way that can make them go into a place where they're assuming that the worst is going to happen. When we watch cable news, they're going to tell you these people are Nazis, these people are garbage, they're going to throw you in camps, they're going to do this. We've even heard candidates say you're going to be back in chains, all this stuff. You cannot take that and actually act like that is going, all these bad things are going to happen. And I've been in a space where people were assuming all the worst things were likely to happen. Most of which, I'm going to tell you right now, I truly believe, and I want you to walk away with this, I truly believe that while this is a very consequential election, we are going to be okay after this election. You will survive this election. And not only will you survive this election, you will have an opportunity to help others and to help people flourish after this election is over, regardless of who gets elected. You will survive this and you will have an opportunity to glorify God by how you help other people survive this. And so if you are in a place right now where you are feeling hopeless, let me tell you about Jesus. Let me tell you about what he's done for us and that he's in control of everything that happens. And even if there are hard times that are on the horizon, because that can come with an election, you have a reason to go forward. You have a reason to love your opponents, and you will have opportunities to flourish. And anybody who's telling you different, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily a bad person, but you need to cut that off for right now because you have a reason to move forward. And the level of disdain and contempt and hopelessness that even some Christian leaders have allowed people to get to because they want their candidate to win, it's just disheartening. But I truly believe that regardless of who wins this, it will be impactful, but you will survive. You will laugh again. The people that love you, your loved ones, they will still be here after this happens, after next week. You'll still be able to tell jokes and be endeared to people and show people how much you care about them. Life is not going to end after this election. And it's a shame that some of us don't have the sobriety to communicate that to other people when we're trying to get somebody elected. So if you find yourself in despair after this election, if you find yourself wondering how to move forward, I'm going to tell you to pray. If you go to church even more. Find a prayer group. Find a Bible study. Find people to sit down and pray with you. Hey, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, whatever it is, find 2 prayer groups. And if you do that, I promise you, you will find that you're going to survive this and that it's not as bad as some people are saying it's going to be. You're going to be okay. You're going to be all right. Well, Ann Camp, as you already know, there's a cross that neither political conservatism nor progressivism is fit to bear. There's a civic hearing in need of faithful witnesses who love social justice and won't surrender the truth to be loved by the world. Politic with the boldness and compassion of Jesus Christ. Until next time, Ann Camp, I'll holla at you.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Amen. Got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.